Hello. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on on a Saturday evening. I know that is because people are really interested and keen on attending this talk organized under the auspices of the JSLL Distinguished Lecture Series. This is the fourth installment, and we are delighted today to have on board Professor Dr. Baidik Bhattacharya. Uh, as most of you must be knowing, Professor Baidik Bhattacharya is Associate Professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Society, CSDS, Delhi. He's the author of Post-Colonial Writing in the Era of World Literature, Texts, Territories, Globalizations, and the Literary Sovereign, Colonial Histories and the Modern Culture of Letters, which is a forthcoming book of his. He's the editor of the Cambridge Companion to World Literature and the British Empire, which is also a forthcoming book, and co-editor of the Post-Colonial Gramsci, which was published in 2012, as well as Novel Formation, The New Indian Beginnings of European Form. Besides this, his essays have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Boundary 2, Novel, New Literary History, Interventions, Post-Colonial Studies, among other places. Today, he's going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is derived from his previous work and research, the literary sovereign, how colonial histories shaped the modern culture of letters. So without further ado, I would like to pass for the baton to Professor Baidik Bhattacharya and welcome him as part of this JSL Distinguished Lecture Series. So over to you, Professor Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Professor Kale. Thank you for this warm introduction. Let me just share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me begin by thanking JSLL and particularly Dr. Kanupriya Dhingra for this invitation to be here today and to be able to share my work with all of you. Let me start with this image. What you are seeing on your screen is from an early 19th century text entitled Curry and Rice on 40 Plates, or The Ingredients of Social Life in Our Station in India, written by George Franklin Atkinson, a captain at the Bengal Engineers. The text is divided into 40 short pieces with titles like Our Station, Our Judge, Our Judge's Wife, Our Magistrate, Our Magistrate's Wife, Our Invalid Major, and so on, accompanied by colored plates of lithographs and etchings depicting these assorted subjects. The image on the screen right now is the illustration for this section, Our Munshi. As you may have guessed from the title of the book and also of these individual sections, that this is a set of satirical reflections on the banality and drudgery of colonial life in India. But I want to draw your attention to the two central figures here, huddled together and poring over a book in rapt attention. The European man, clearly a colonial official in his flannel outfit, occupies the center of the visual space and, significantly enough, holds the book in his hand. One can also notice a few more books and manuscripts put together on the table behind him. Equally important is the figure sitting next to him in trademark dhoti, chadar, and pagri, the ubiquitous munshi, which basically meant native scholar and scribe, guiding the sahib through what is presumably a book of Oriental provenance. As the accompanying text notes, this is a depiction of the regular session where the munshi trains the colonial official in Oriental tongues and reads with him texts in Hindustan. Now, this scene, the image on your screen, has two very distinct genealogies in early colonial histories in India. The first one is the 1772 resolution of Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of Bengal, to, and I quote, this is a quote you can also see on your screen, to adapt the company's regulations to the manners and understandings of the people of India and the exigencies of the country, adhering as closely as we are able to their ancient usages and institutions. Unquote. This set of regulations led to an event quite unprecedented in history. A colonial power translating and codifying local legal texts or legal systems like the Sharia and the Dharmashastra, representing Islamic and Hindu laws, respectively, and then claiming its sovereign power by citing these very translations. This colonial investment in local law and jurisprudence was evident in translations like the following, some of which you can see on your screen. Nathaniel Brassey Hullhead, A Code of Gentoo Laws or Ordinations of the Pandits, 1776. Charles Hamilton, The Hidayah or Guide, A Commentary on the Musalman Laws, 1791. William Jones, Al-Shiraziyah, or the Mohammedan Law of Inheritance with a Commentary, 1792. William Jones, once again, Institutes of Hindu Law or the Ordinances of Manu, 1796. H.T. Colebrook, A Digest of Hindu Law on Contracts and Succession, 1797, among many others. At the same time, however, these colonial officials also translated a host of culturally different texts. Jones's translation of Kalidas's Shakuntala, 1789, and Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, 1792, Abraham Hyacinth Akhtil Duperno's translation Zendavesta in French, 1771, and of the Upanishad in 1786, Charles Wilkins's translation of the Bhagavad Gita or Dialogues of Krishna and Arjun, 1785, and the Hitopadesha of Vishnu Sharma, 1787, among many more. Apart from these volumes, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, established in 1784 with Jones as the first president, started publishing translation and extensive research by colonial officials on local languages, religions, cultural practices, and just about everything they found remarkable among the natives in its official publication with the title Asiatic Researches. From 1800, the college at Fort William in Calcutta published a large number of translations from different Indian languages, along with grammars and dictionaries in an attempt to train young colonial writers or clerks who arrived from England in their late teens. Within a couple of decades, as a result, the company was able to generate a textualized world of native culture and religion, a world sustained through philological and hermeneutic conventions that was ready for both citation and circulation. Through the circuits of imperial culture of the 18th century, these translations traveled beyond South Asia and reached different parts of the world, leading to what Raymond Schwab calls the Second Renaissance of Europe, or its Oriental Renaissance. The second source of this image, the image with the Sahib and his Munshi, the second source is concerned with a public order issued by Lord Wellesley, the Governor General, in December 1798 that stated, and I quote, and the quote is also on the screen, "His Lordship in Council hereby apprises the civil servants of the company in Bengal that from and after 1st of January 1801, no servant will be deemed eligible to any of the aforementioned offices until he shall have passed an examination in the laws and regulations and in the languages, a knowledge of which is hereby deemed to be an indispensable qualification for such respective offices," unquote. Such an order not only made language learning a mandatory part of colonial governance, it also led to a typical situation that another prolific colonial official, W. Hunter, described as the dual responsibility of, he says, public work and services to scholarship in order to uphold what he calls the British suzerainty. Very soon, these two sources, the first one starting with Warren Hastings and the second one with Lord Wellesley, these two sources would lead to what I'll very soon describe as a rule of philology. Now, to come back to this image once again, it represents two different aspects of the material discursive conditions of early colonial rule in India. Its internal transformations to colonial governmentality that enlisted disciplines like philology and anthropology, and its position in the larger geopolitics of the 18th century empire. It is within the field constituted by these two forces that I want to trace today the genealogy of the idea of the literary, its transformation from being what Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Languages defined as learning or skill in letters in 1755 to its almost exclusive reliance on the tropological dimensions of language by the end of the century. Now, here I want to clarify one thing, that this argument is concerned with the notion of literary or its counterparts in other European languages. I'm not describing similar concepts in various other cultures, because every time I present from this project, the first question inevitably is like, but sir, Sahitya has a very different genealogy. Of course it does. I'm not describing Sahitya, I'm not describing Adab. I'm describing, or I'm speculating on this very idea of the literary and its various other similar concepts in other European languages. My wager is that the modern idea of the literary as a sovereign order of textuality since the 18th century, as autonomous, autotelic, and singular, was co-produced with an extraordinary model of colonial sovereignty in the far-flung colony of British India. The new colonial regime was poised on its ability to turn the territory into a readable space, with its cartographic and textual signs overlaid on each other, and on the ambition of constituting a totalizing schema of representation. At the same time, such a fundamental transformation of the colony could not have been possible either in its territorial seclusion or within any single domain deemed to be properly governmental. Hence, drawing on disparate resources like local legal canons, Oriental scribal cultures, Indian manners and customs, English common law, European aesthetics, and changing character of colonial occupation across continents, the new regime gave birth to what I call the literary sovereign. Within this new idea, the colonial administration sought to bring together political sovereignty and literary singularity with the further aim of constituting a thoroughly textualized sovereign power modeled on what the colonial translators identified as a self-governing literary language evident in a host of Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic texts. No doubt this conclusion, or rather this resolution, was designed as a response to a number of crises the company faced at the time. But its other outcome was decisive. It defined literary language within an autonomous, non-mimetic, and performative mode of textuality, and constituted the modern field of literature. The literary sovereign, in other words, set out two templates at the same time. One for colonial governance that would be represented or repeated in different parts of Asia and Africa in subsequent centuries, and the other for the new idea of literature that would soon transform culture across the colonial divide. Historians have argued that the specificities of colonial rule in the 18th century were determined by what is often called the ideology of early colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. During this period, and before settling for an unbreachable colonial difference in the 19th century, the colonial administration often overlapped with or appropriated what were seen as typically Indian practices and values. This was evident in the construction of the literary sovereign as well. Excuse me. The model of state-based sovereignty, popular in Europe since the Westphalian peace in 1648, and described by Hegel in the Elements of the Philosophy of Rights as the effects of the ideality of a perfect Reichsstaat, faced serious challenges in the colonies during the 18th century. In India, unlike in previous British colonies in Ireland, North America, and the Caribbean, the crisis was much more acute, since a public joint stock company with monopoly rights, assumed a quasi-state status and performed some of the activities like collecting revenues or waging wars that were associated exclusively with the state in European political imagination. This unusual status of the company led Edmund Burke, one of the fiercest critics of the East India Company, to allege that the company was in possession of, and I quote, those high and almost incommunicable prerogatives of sovereignty, which were hardly ever known before to be parted with to any subjects, and which in several states were not wholly entrusted to the prince or head of the Commonwealth himself, unquote. As a consequence, he famously declared, and I quote again, the East India Company in India is a state in the disguise of a merchant. Its whole service is a system of public offices in the disguise of a counting house, unquote. In a similar vein, Adam Smith noted in his well-known book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, first published in 1776, the strange absurdity, these are Smith's words, the strange absurdity of the company that treated, and I quote, the character of the sovereign as but an appendix to that of the merchant, unquote. This scandalous model of what historians have variously called the dual sovereignty or diarchy, the company state, a distant sovereignty, or simply anarchy, therefore needed an equally unusual resolution. It was also evident that this resolution could not have come either from normative legal juridical discourses in Europe or from political institutions like the parliament and monarchy. In my opinion, and this is my argument, the key to understanding the colonial resolution to this rather elusive problem of sovereignty is the company's investment in large-scale translations of local legal canons and its subsequent attempt to link these laws to what the administrators often called the manners and customs of indigenous population. Manners and customs is the 18th century equivalent of what we now call culture, roughly. In 1772, this, while facing multiple crises at home and in the colony, Warren Hastings sought to anchor the new regime within local legal traditions and proposed his regulations to follow indigenous manners, understandings, usages, and institutions. Hastings even claimed to have unraveled the ancient constitution of the country, and based on this doctrine, proposed to overhaul the administration of the new colony. It was further held that the foreignness of Hindu and Islamic laws could be tamed only if one knew enough about the equally foreign cultural matrix within which they operated, and consequently, the colonial claim to sovereign power could be secured only if its new legal regime could be shown as originating from these ancient but continuous cultural roots. The cultural universe of India, according to Hastings's plan, had to function both as an internal framework for the new colonial regime and also as the eventual horizon of its political ambition. Any claim to sovereign power for the company had to navigate this essential duality of culture. Disciplines like philology and anthropology became especially useful in this context, and soon the colonial administrators not only translated native legal, religious, and cosmological texts, but also wrote copious grammars and dictionaries of local languages with the belief that such philological tools were necessary techniques of governance. Through a remarkable assortment of legal and cultural registers, the company established a Janus facet regime. While the origins of its sovereign power could be traced back to India's ancient legal systems, the rule of law, or its own rule of law, that was the claim, was modern enough to distinguish itself from various pre-colonial administrations. It was the strategic deployment of local culture as a justificatory narrative for its rule, as also its final governmental ambition, that allowed the company to secure such a unique form of sovereignty. My name for this colonial resolution, that is the literary sovereign, is designed to map this new concept of power across the abstraction of law and an anthropological description of culture. While working on local manners and customs, many of the colonial administrators identified a distinctly Oriental or Eastern mode of writing, especially in poetry, that collapsed the ontic and the phenomenal aspects of a language in the very act of its performance. In stark contrast to the neoclassical aesthetic ideals of contemporary Europe, this mode of writing did not follow the principle of mimetic imitation and certainly did not adhere to any classical model of order and decorum. Instead, what one encountered in such texts was a form of allegory that did not have any secondary reference or a metaphor that made no distinction between the vehicle and the tenor, or perhaps even a mode of language that produced meaning only within its own limits. Unlike the classical or biblical allegories that these officials knew well, the ubiquitous, or rather the uniqueness of this kind of Oriental writing emerged from its suspension of reference to an extra-textual world, or from its manifestly autonomous and autotelic being. Colonial officials insisted that this was not simply a generic quality, but a broader mode of being of both language and its attendant culture that separated Oriental writing from its European counterpart. If one were to make sense of this singular species of writing, one not only had to place its performative language as opposed to the veridical one, its performative language within a self-sufficient textual world, one also had to assume a cultural consensus that would lend credence to such hermetic textuality. Way before any European precedents, colonial administrators identified this sovereign order of textuality in the Orient across texts and territories and proposed it as the proper domain of the literary. What I call the literary sovereign is precisely the overlap between this form of Oriental writing and the new colonial sovereignty, as both espoused an autonomous textual order within a specific cultural milieu, and both embodied a form of truth that could have been established only across this text culture continuum. I do not mean that one imitated the other, but I do submit that political sovereignty and literary singularity were co-produced in this case, and they reinforced each other in their respective careers. The literary sovereign, in other words, marked a form of textuality that was radically different from contemporary standards of Europe, especially of mimetic imitation or repetition, in its self-enclosed performativity and specific to the Orient in its cultural details. It was, however, the potent combination of political expediency and textual autonomy in the new idea that marked its uniqueness in imperial history. Once language was dissociated from its role of mimetic representation, and once it was reimagined within a politically bounded space like the colony, it was possible for the colonial government to deploy this form of textuality to ever expansive fields and purposes. Indeed, by the turn of the century, the literary sovereign inaugurated translation and textualization as essential mechanisms of governance. This was, of course, facilitated by the company's growing reliance on writing and print to define the distinctiveness of its rule, but this close association with governmental institutions shaped the other characteristic feature of the literary sovereign, that it got irrevocably inflected by the spirit of anthropology. Now, one of the ways Europe made sense of the literary sovereign was the conceptual grid of wealth literature or world literature. As Goethe's discussions with his disciple Johann Peter Eckermann from 1827 onwards suggests, the term was meant to bring together an anthropological description of the world and a new aesthetic idea of literature. And its primary aim was to domesticate the foreignness associated with what Europe saw as its essential other, both historically and textually. This was part of what Gayatri Spivak has shown as the crisis of European thought in the era of expanding imperialism. And in this period of tenuous philosophical tenets and dubious claims of universality, the literary sovereign offered a unique way to make sense of a history that was larger than anything that Europe ever had to grapple with. When Goethe suggested the idea of world literature to Eckermann, he was aware of the countless translations and retranslations of the texts that came out of the colonial world. He also knew, at least partially, the great number or the great amount of research material circulating in Europe through Asiatic Researches, the journal published by the Asiatic Society of Bengal. As a consequence, when he set out to formulate his version of world literature, he did so through an unusual combination of aesthetic and anthropological registers. To conclude, my point is that in order to decolonize the very idea of literature, one needs to go beyond Europe and before Romanticism and place the genealogy of this new cultural idiom within the histories of modern colonialism. It seems to me that, like so many other critical concepts that dominate the global intellectual discussions today, the literary as a distinct mode of being of language does not belong to any one culture or history. Instead, it telescopes a range of ideas and practices from different cultural worlds and fashions its own being through histories of violent colonial encounters in the 18th century. Traces of this multicultural, multilingual, and intermedial history generated through colonial governmentality and imperial networks are still visible in the life and career of the new concept. And I wish to capture these traces and small histories through the theoretical greed of the literary sovereign. Once the myth of Romanticism as the origin point for this notion of literature is set aside, however, one is perforce led to the bewildering profusion of manuscripts, languages, scribal traditions, translation and untranslatability, appropriation, plain forgery, philological claims and counterclaims, archival records, disciplinary rivalry, all put together like an enormous jigsaw puzzle by imperial histories. The concept of the literary sovereign, thus, is an invitation to step into this world of entangled texts and territories, of philological inquiries and political powers, of the literary and the sovereign. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.